question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the very first question that any member of the House should ask themselves when debating any legislative change regarding education is this going to be good for education? That should be our first question when we're debating any changes in the education system, and on that count, this bill fails on the very first hurdle because it will not be good for education. The question the government asked themselves is, how do we get the votes in the House? Well, we do it by giving John Banks charter schools. Is this consistent with the ACT Party ideology rather than is this consistent with the evidence-based approach to education? Mr. Speaker, we should start from the presumption that we have a very good education system in New Zealand, and our challenge is not to fix something that isn't broken. It's to take a very good education system and make it a great education system. And we can do that, but there is no evidence that charter schools are going to lead to improved results for New Zealand kids. There is no evidence, in fact there is very compelling evidence to the contrary, that having unqualified teachers in classrooms will lead to better educational outcomes. It won't. It is a recipe for a disaster. Mr. Speaker, narrowing the focus of the education system in the way the current government are intent on doing is not going to be good for New Zealand kids. We should be focused on making sure that every student in New Zealand has the opportunity to reach their full potential, and that means teaching them a broad and balanced curriculum. I'm glad Hekia Parata agrees with that, because everything that this government is doing goes in the opposite direction, goes in the direction of narrowing the focus of our education system down to two measures of success. Hekia Parata has two measures of success, national standards and NCEA level 2. And according to Hekia Parata, that is the only measure of success for our education system, and that is fundamentally wrong. There are so many other things that go on within the education system that are far more important to that Hekia Parata simply fails to acknowledge. This bill does not require even that the head teacher in a charter school be a qualified and registered teacher. Even people who were in favour of charter schools, even the people who came to the Select Committee to argue in favour of charter schools, almost without exception, argued that teachers teaching in them should be qualified and registered. Qualified and registered. And yet the government continue to turn their backs on amendments. I think teachers in Kura Kaupapa should be registered teachers. And the fact that we have a shortage of registered teachers in Kura Kaupapa is something that the government should be focused on addressing, not lowering the bar, not lowering the standard for teachers. John Banks says, shush, 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 he doesn't like hearing the truth. He doesn't like hearing the truth, although I suspect Mr. Banks is going to hear a lot more about the truth in another area in the next few weeks. But let's talk about the truth around charter schools. Having unregistered and unqualified teachers in our schools will not be good for education. Now, who should we listen to on that? Well, we could listen to one of the many contradictory statements that the Prime Minister has made about that. Because, in fact, a year ago, John Key was telling the country, and I'll give you a quote, it's not class sizes that matter, it's the quality of teaching that we're getting in our schools. So what's the government's solution to that? The government's solution to that issue is to simply remove the requirement for teachers to be trained and qualified for the job that they are going to do. Because make no bones about it, that is what this legislation does. It allows charter schools to be established without qualified and registered teachers, and that's not going to be good for education. Under this legislation, a teacher subject to disciplinary action in the state school system could go and teach in a charter school.
That's right.
And the government are silent. They're silent because they know that's true, that a teacher who is suspended from the state school system could walk down the road to a charter school and they could get a job, and there is nothing in this bill that will stop them from doing that. Absolutely nothing in this bill that will stop them from doing that. That is fundamentally wrong. I invite the Minister right now to tell me which clause stops this from happening. There is no clause. She's shaking her head because there is no clause that stops a teacher who is the subject of disciplinary action teaching in a charter school. That is absolutely fundamentally wrong, and the Labour Party will under no circumstances support this. We recognise that the quality of teaching is vitally important to educational outcomes. It is the single biggest in-school influencer of student achievement, and yet this government, while they talk about valuing quality teaching, do so many things that go in the opposite direction. It's not just around charter schools. They promise to focus on teacher professional development, and yet they have cut $15 million from the budget for teacher professional development. Under this national government, teachers have lost $15 million a year in professional development funding. That's not the action of a government that cares about raising the quality of teaching in New Zealand. What did John Key say again after last year's budget, where they thought that the big solution to improving the quality of education was to put more kids in every class? What did John Key say? He said, we have to find another way to go and lift those teacher outcomes, and we'll go away and do that. Well, this seems to be his answer. John Key's answer to lifting the quality of teaching in New Zealand is to remove the requirement for teachers to be trained and qualified. That is fundamentally wrong. Now, the government's own advisers, the Ministry of Education, who of course probably do start the analysis of this from the question, is this good for education? And what have they said? They have advised, and it's a quote, that there is a potential for a negative impact on students' education from teachers who do not meet the minimum standards for the profession. That's what the Ministry of Education has said, and they have also argued that the changes in this bill will significantly damage the credibility of the Crown. I agree with the Ministry of Education that this will significantly damage the credibility of the Crown, because the government should be focused on lifting the quality of teaching in New Zealand, on making sure that every school in New Zealand is a good school. Every school in New Zealand is a good school, not trying to pour money into private, profit-making institutions, because money that is going for profits of the private providers of these charter schools are not going to go as money that is not going into quality teacher education. I talked about teacher and school safety a moment ago, and we agree with the amendments that have been made in this bill around student surrender and retention of student property, and we worked through that process with the members of the Select Committee very constructively, and I want to thank all of the members of the Select Committee for the manner in which they approached that particular debate. I think we came to a very sensible compromise outcome in the end. But I am concerned about student safety from being in classrooms with unqualified, unregistered teachers. And we were unable to reach any agreement on that because the government followed Catherine Isaac's advice, who came along and said, do not water down the purity of this legislation. The ideological purity of the legislation should not be watered down. That's what Catherine Isaacs advised the Select Committee, and that's exactly what the National Party members on the Select Committee said that they would not do. There is... Yes, in early childhood centres, they have to have at least 50% of the teachers in early childhood centres have to be qualified, and they don't have to be in charter schools. Why should students in charter schools have a lower standard than those in early childhood education? And in fact, until this national government came along, we were working towards having 100% qualified teachers in early childhood education, but the government don't like having qualified teachers because they've lowered the standard in early childhood education to 50%, and now they're removing it altogether for charter schools. Actually, we believe in quality teaching, and we believe in having registered, qualified teachers in classrooms and including in early childhood education settings. That's something that this government don't support. So now they're going to lower the standard. Rather than focusing on how do we get more teachers who are qualified and who are filling the skill shortages and the gaps that we do have, and we've got some big gaps, rather than focusing on that, and rather than focusing on saying, how can we improve the quality of teaching by making every teacher a brilliant teacher, they're saying, let's just do away with the requirements altogether, and that is fundamentally wrong. There are so many other aspects of this legislation that are wrong that I'm sure we will get into as we get to the debate on the committee stage of this. Charter schools won't have to enrol students who live right next door. A charter school could decline the enrolment of a student that lives right next door to the school. No problem with that. There is nothing to stop a public school in Christchurch being closed, being forced to close by Hekia Parata, only to have a charter school then pop up on exactly the same site. And that is fundamentally wrong as well. That is also very, very wrong. charter schools will not have to teach to the curriculum. They won't have to teach to the New Zealand curriculum. They won't have to teach science in the way that public schools have to do. They could teach creationism. They could teach creationism under the wording of this legislation, and there's nothing the government could do to stop it. It is fundamentally wrong. This is bad legislation. It's going to be bad for education. It's not based on evidence of what works, and the Labour Party will certainly not be supporting it. We have not supported it at all up to this stage, and we will not be supporting it from this point onwards.
Hear, hear.
Good speak.
Honourable John Banks.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak in favour of the